Isha Lodha, the President of the English Debating Society for 2024, to chair the second debate for today.
Thank you, ma'am. The topic for the next debate is the United Nations has lost its relevance in resolving global conflicts. I request the Prime Minister of Side Proposition, Hannah Reggie, to express her views.
With the permission of the chairperson, I would like to begin my debate. Dear children of the future, I apologize. I apologize on behalf of all of us in the present who have placed our faith in an organization that merely promises to help peace prevail, but looks on helplessly as war clouds gather over different parts of the world, that condemns conflicts but cowers before those who actually cause it, that desires democracy but defers to the directions of power-hungry dictators. Good afternoon, esteemed judges and the House at large. The United Nations has always displayed a biased approach in favor of either rich or powerful countries. In the 1970s, when Pol Pot, the leader of Khmer Rouge, a political communist group, took over Cambodia and inflicted genocide for 4 long years, the United Nations still allowed that country to have a seat in the United Nations until 1982. And why? Because China said so. And because the United States did not even acknowledge that genocide was taking place in Cambodia. So, what did the United Nations do as 2 million people were ruthlessly murdered by the Khmer Rouge? Nothing. Fast forward to the 21st century, what has changed in the United Nations? Again, absolutely nothing. The military of Myanmar has mercilessly massacred thousands of Rohingya men, women, and even children. The United Nations cannot or will not do anything because China supports the military regime of Myanmar. Why? China itself has incarcerated and abused millions of people from the minority Uyghur community and is getting away with it. It is simple. After all, China's financial contributions to the United Nations is second only to the United States. This simply proves the fact that the more money a nation contributes to the UN, the more influence it has on the resolutions passed by it. I really want to mention the example of Sudan and Syria, how Russia and China vetoed 2 resolutions against it. And still, the United Nations stands dumbfounded. But due to the lack of time, I would like to wind up my debate. If the United Nations continues to move in such a pace and if it continues to degrade in such a manner, ladies and gentlemen, let me remind you that countless lives will continue to perish in wars that the world will completely forget about. And while all of this does happen, the United Nations will simply wag its finger and shake its head in disapproval and do nothing. That isn't much help, is it? Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. I now request Deldin, the leader of the opposition, to share her views on the topic.
With the permission of the chair. Flags of many, hearts as one, building bridges where was not one, talks for peace, a future bright, United Nations guiding light. Good afternoon to the House at large. Today, I, the leader of side opposition, stand before you to dismiss the preposterous narrative that the United Nations, an organization whose sole purpose is to maintain global peace and cooperation, has lost its relevance in resolving global conflicts. In case side proposition is unable to recognize the obvious irony that seeps through these words, I will dissect the discussion at hand to assist them in acknowledging their dangerously false stance. The United Nations was founded, as the preamble of the Charter puts it, to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. To begin, I will emphasize upon the key words in this discussion. First up, relevance refers to a relation to the matter at hand. To state that the United Nations, an organization first established after the World War II, when nations were in ruins and yearned for peace, an organization created to end war, promote peace, justice, and better living for all humankind is irrelevant, is absolutely absurd and illogical. It's similar to saying that teachers have lost their relevance in educating, and I am certain that none of us would agree with such a statement. Secondly, resolving. Settle or find a solution to a problem. Since 1948, the United Nations has helped end conflicts and foster reconciliation by conducting successful peacemaking operations in dozens of countries. Let's be realistic and acknowledge that if it had not been for the United Nations, the state our nations and resources would be in is unimaginable. In the Ukraine and Russia war, the United Nations has been of incredible service by imposing sanctions upon Russia and delivering emergency aid and assistance to people across Ukraine and neighboring areas. The United Nations is the only place that speaks for everyone on earth and the only place where all nations come together. It is also important to note that the United Nations is not a monolithic organization. It is made up of 193 member states, each with its own interests and agenda. To bring all 193 member states to a single conclusive decision is an enormous task, one that the United Nations has undertaken. Now that we face many global challenges ranging from environmental degradation and infectious diseases to terrorism, international lawmaking through the United Nations is the best and possibly only means to maintain and promote international peace and security. Considering all of this, the United Nations has definitely been essential and always will be essential in resolving conflicts in the most cooperative and successful way possible. With this, I rest my case, but not my voice. Thank you.
Thank you, Dalton. I would like to request everyone in the audience to stop slouching and sit up straight. Next up, we have the Deputy Prime Minister of Side Proposition, Arif Puri, to present his views.
With the permission of the chair, I would like to begin my debate. Ineffective, incapable, and inefficient. These are the unflattering adjectives that come to mind when one thinks of the role the United Nations has played in the global conflict resolution in recent times. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I, Arif Puri, the Deputy Prime Minister of the Side Proposition, stand before you today not as a pessimist who sees the dark side of everything that is good, but as a realist who calls a spade a spade. And that is why I couldn't help agreeing with the Ukrainian President, Volodymyr Zelensky, who lashed out at the UN Security Council in September last year, calling it powerless to do anything to stop the war in Ukraine. By giving Russia veto power, the United Nations has indeed given it a license to whitewash the ongoing aggression and genocide that it is brazenly inflicting upon Ukraine. The highest powers are given to the UN Security Council instead of the General Assembly, even though 193 countries make up the General Assembly. Until the outdated structure of the United Nations is radically reformed, the UN Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres' vision of a peaceful multipolar world will be nothing but a deceptive mirage. The sad reality is that even in the 21st century, the UN falls short of various ethnicities, races, and cultures in its decision-making bodies. Many African and Latin American countries lack sufficient influence and a voice in shaping global policies. This brings me to my second constructive argument, ladies and gentlemen. Due to the outdated structure of the UN, most of its decisions are dictated by the geopolitics and selfish interests of the P5 members of the Security Council: Russia, the UK, the USA, France, and China, which are further split into two camps. the UK, the USA, and Russia in one, and China and France in the other. Israel continues to relentlessly pound Palestinian homes and families. The number of human rights violations just keeps on increasing, but Israel couldn't care less about the United Nations. Why should it, when the United Nations, exercising its veto power, has consistently opposed resolutions critical of Israel's actions? While the UN kept contradicting itself, the war in Yemen continued for 8 years. 377,000 lives have been lost and millions have been displaced. The United Nations has provided aid, but it's too little, too late. The conflict has still not been resolved because, quite frankly, the United Nations is clueless about how to deal with it. While missiles rain down on defenseless little children in Gaza and Ukraine, all that the United Nations will continue to do is to strongly condemn the violence, and for this reason, side proposition condemns the United Nations. Thank you.
Thank you, Arab. Next up, we have the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, Himanshi, to present her views.
Good afternoon to the House at large. Today, as a Deputy Leader of the side opposition, I would like to present my case and prove to you why the side proposition's arguments are flawed. Firstly, to clear up the fog emitted by the side proposition, I would like to clarify the meaning of the term UN. UN is not a single entity that can solve all our problems. It is most definitely not a genie in a bottle. The United Nations is an organization consisting of 193 countries. It is that one place on earth where all the world's nations can gather together, discuss common problems, and find shared solutions. Solutions that will satisfy all the 193 countries. Ladies and gentlemen, I would also like to explain the meaning of the term global conflict. It means an incompatibility between two or more opinions, principles, or interests that have a significant international impact. Therefore, things like the Paris Agreement, the Kyoto Protocol, the Nagoya Protocol, etc. are global conflicts, and the United Nations has solved them. Had they not been solved, who knows what position we would right now be in. For my first constructive, let us consider the crucial role of peacekeeping. Since 1948, the United Nations has deployed peacekeeping missions to over 70 countries. Over the course of 72 years, United Nations peacekeeping has evolved to meet the demands of global conflicts and a changing political landscape. Today, peacekeepers perform a variety of complex tasks beyond military operations, including institutional building, human rights monitoring, disarmament, demobilization, and many others, which the Chief Whip will be elaborating upon. My second constructive focuses on security, which is an essential aspect of peacekeeping. In contemporary conflicts, up to 90% of casualties, 90% of casualties, ladies and gentlemen, are civilians, particularly women and children. Recognizing this, the United Nations Security Council has passed resolutions 1325 on women, peace and security, which acknowledges the indulgence of women and gender perspectives in decision making can strengthen prospects for sustainable peace. The United Nations has also constantly called upon parties in disputes to seek peaceful means of resolutions. The swift response of the UN to condemn the Iraq's invasion on Kuwait in 1990 is a prime example of conflict settlement by the UN. This clearly shows the vital role the UN has played to prevent conflicts from escalating into global conflicts. I would now like to end my debate by the words of Ralph Bunche. The United Nations is our one great hope for peaceful and a free world. Unquote. Thank you.
Thank you, Himanshi. Next, we have the Chief Whip of Side Proposition, Ruhani.
people singing the songs of angry men. It is the music of the people who will not be slaves again. Who will be strong and stand with me? Good afternoon, everyone. As the chief of our side proposition, I will dwell on how indecisive the United Nations has been in resolving global conflicts. The United Nations was formed after World War II in an attempt to maintain international peace and security, and according to its charter, to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. Good intentions, but poor execution and implementation. The current conflict of Gaza did not suddenly erupt overnight. Israel brazenly carried on with expanding its settlement and imposed an unlawful and inhuman blockade on Gaza, which devastated its economy. The United Nations remained a silent spectator. It was in 1950 that the Chinese army took control of Tibet. It is 2024 and Tibet is still not free. His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, appealed to the United Nations for help thrice, but each time it did was to pass an ineffective resolution condemning the act of China. His Holiness himself has not been welcomed at the United Nations because that would offend China, wouldn't it? In fact, it was for the first time in 4 decades that a speech of his was read out by a representative in the United Nations in 2000. This brings me to my next argument. The UN is and has been ambivalent through a lot of history's conflict. The example in point is the Rwandan genocide of 1994. In just 100 days, about 800,000 people, I repeat, in just 100 days, about 800,000 people were slaughtered in Rwanda by ethnic Hutu extremists. The United Nations disgracefully abandoned the Rwandan people, leaving them to fend for themselves. Nothing much has changed since then. Our respected External Affairs Minister, Mr. S. Jaishankar, slammed the United Nations by stating, "The UN Security Council is like an old club, where there are set members who do not want to let go of their grip, so they're not keen to admit more members or have their practices questioned. Trust in the United Nations is fast eroding. The question is it willing or able enough to do anything about it?" Thank you.
Thank you, Ruhani. We now have the Chief Whip of Side Opposition, Naman Baranwal.
Banners raised from every land, one table where all voices stand. For peace they strive and for justice they fight. United Nations, beacon bright. Good afternoon to the House at large. I, as the Chief Whip of Side Opposition, will now take a stand under the shadow of this troubling narrative that the United Nations has lost its relevance. And I will try to help you, the audience, to reach the absolute root of this case and save us from all the utter tame attempts by the proposition trying to deviate us from it. This whole debate is revolving around the word relevance. As explained by the leader of the opposition, relevance refers to the relation to the matter at hand. So for the proposition to claim that the United Nations has lost its relevance, ultimately claiming that the beacon of absolute hope and prosperity of our world, which has been maintaining world peace for over 70 years, has lost its relevance, this is utterly foolish and ignorant on their part. Now, as for the part of peacekeeping, consider the peacekeeping missions done by the UN. These missions, with over 80,000 personnel strong, act as a buffer between warring parties, creating space for diplomacy and helping civilians. Members of the House, let me tell you an old story about Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. It is said that Adam said to Eve, "Eve, is there someone else?" Think about that for a moment. You could ask the same question about the United Nations. Is there another organization in the world which brings together all the countries of the world to work together for common objectives in all the collective interest? There clearly is not. Currently, in the Israel-Hamas conflict, the fact that
South Africa appealed to the International Court of Justice, accusing Israel of committing genocide against Gazans in its war against Hamas. The fact that Israel had to fight against this appeal, the fact that Israel had to defend themselves in this apparent organization, which, as the proposition claims to have lost all its relevance, is, I must say, quite like the side proposition has committed genocide against their own arguments. What is the alternative to the United Nations? It is a world where conflicts fester unchecked, a world where the humanitarian catastrophes go unaddressed, a world where the powerful dictate the fate of the weak. Instead, let us focus on reform. Let us focus on a more modern Security Council which tackles the problems of the 21st century. Let us empower regional organizations to tackle conflicts closer to home, with the UN playing a vital supporting role. The UN may not be perfect, but it is the best system we have. It is a forum for dialogue. It is a platform for collective speech. It is a beacon of hope in a world often shrouded in darkness. So let us not abandon it, but work together to strengthen it. Because if it may not have been for them, we would have not been sitting here listening to me speak in this debate. We would have been amidst of World War III. Thank you.
Thank you, Naman. I now invite Delvin, the leader of the opposition, to present her rebuttal.
As the side proposition spins a tale worthy of a barge, I'm reminded of a quote by a famous philosopher. Empty vessels make the most noise. Ladies and gentlemen, side proposition today has been very monotonous as they have only talked about veto power. But I would like to take the liberty to remind them that veto power has existed for the Big Five since forever. And the United Nations has accomplished so much even against the Big Five. The Security Council's veto power, often wielded by a selected few, can impede decisive action. But to abandon the United Nations due to these challenges is to throw away the baby with bathwater. The deputy leader has given enough examples to prove, because of which I do not want to waste my time repeating. I think that the side proposition has failed to understand that the United Nations is not solely responsible for ending conflicts. While it plays a crucial role in conflict resolution and peacekeeping, the responsibility for ending conflicts ultimately lies within the parties involved in the conflict and international community as a whole. I would like to remind the side proposition that the United Nations has done a lot in solving and reducing the consequences of the Russia-Ukraine war and the Israel-Gaza conflict. Side propositions' opinions today are like those broken calculators, one that do not count. I'm afraid they have failed to understand the meaning of today's motion. It isn't about the inefficiency of the United Nations in solving global conflicts, but it is about its irrelevance, and even though the United Nations may have become inefficient, it has in no way, shape or form lost its relevance. On 18 December 1956, the United Nations General Assembly approved a resolution calling for the end of Chinese repression against the Tibetans. Ladies and gentlemen, one of the striking things about why the United Nations was created in the first place was that we had a horrendous first half of the 20th century. I think if you look back at those 45 years where we had 2 world wars, countless civil wars, mass expulsions of populations, if the century had gone on like that, we wouldn't have survived to the 21st century. The United Nations may not be able to provide perfect solutions to the global conflicts, but it still holds relevance. In conclusion, I would like to say that the only thing that has lost its relevance is side proposition's argument today. Thank you.
Thank you, Delvin. I now invite Hannah to present her rebuttal.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, once again. we are empty vessels, but empty vessels are way better than vessels filled with poison. I hope you all realize that. And I just noticed that the Prime Minister of the opposition just said that the UN has accomplished so much. So much. Yes, it has. It has accomplished the deaths of millions of people. And if the accomplishment you're talking about is reducing the world population, then I would like to congratulate the side of opposition. So, in the beginning of the debate, the leader of the opposition said that the UN is not a monolithic organization. Yes, it is not. But rather, it is a puppet in the hands of the most powerful nations that roam around roaring like hungry lions to prowl upon weaker nations like India, Africa, and I'm so sorry for telling India, but then other countries like Africa and Sudan and so on. You see, ladies and gentlemen, as it stands today, as I said earlier, the United Nations is merely a puppet in the hands of the most powerful nations like the United Kingdom, the United States of America, China, Russia, France. And they are pulling the strings and the puppet is dancing according to their wills. As an example, I would like to give, you see, you all know what a veto power is, right? And so you see, this power is only given to these 5 nations. Why? So that they can bully these weaker nations a little bit better. And again, our opposition was referring to the UN as a community of 193 countries. I would like to ask you, like, if it is indeed a community of 193 communities, then you better start behaving like that, because otherwise all of us will go extinct in a war now or later. Because you see, the topic for today is constantly losing its relevance. You see, and it means that it is continuously degrading. And the chief whip, in his argument, he said that the United Nations is a table where all nations stand. Do you realize the fact that that Africa is underrepresented in the United Nations? And do you also know that Sudan was refused basic humanitarian need on the 7th of February when it actually appealed for these needs? Then I think you should check that out first. And moreover, relevance, relation at the matter at hand. The only relation the UN has, it is with the most powerful nations, and it cares nothing about weaker nations. Beacon of hope, peace personals. What happened to the 2 vetoes that Russia and China proposed in front of the United Nations pertaining to Syria? A French citizen could not be accepted as a peace personnel in Sudan. What happened to these? I would like to ask the side opposition to kindly review all of their research before they come up and say all of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. You may take your seats along with the audience.